So Carrie, I think your name probably has already been added to the plaque, but I'll get with Peggy to make sure. And then when we get into where we can meet face to face, we'll get a nice picture.
Wow, I'm really honored. Thank you all
Yeah.
to
Well,
my
I know we as board members know that Carrie goes above and beyond and has for a long time now. And so, as the president, I definitely want to say I appreciate you and everything that you do for us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over because you are the sponsor of this meeting. So,
well, thank you very much, Lance, and I'm really happy to work with K. Norman Berry Architects, and I am going to turn it over to our principal, Ed Krebs, and he's going to represent us today with our commercial.
my elevator speech. Hi, everybody. I'm Ed Krebs, one of the principals at K. Norman Berry Associates, and we're real pleased to be able to be a sponsor. And we're really proud of Carrie and everything that she does for us and for SMPS. And if you don't know who KNBA is, we're hoping Carrie's going to make certain that you do. This is our 50th anniversary this year, 2021, and we're very proud to have been serving our great list of clients for 20 years. We do, we're our architectural design firm from master planning through construction, and we're proud to have been on many buildings that we all know, from the Speed Museum to the Fayette County Courthouse, the Kentucky State Capitol, through our specialty and working as preservationists and adaptive reuse. So we're pleased to be here, and we really appreciate SMPS's dedication to the sort of business development for the AEC industry. Thank you all very much. And congratulations, Carrie. And since it wasn't recorded, does that mean it's not real?
I think the plaque will still say it either way.
I hit the recording at the tail end, so I think some of it got on there.
Well, thank you so much, Ed, and thank you again, everyone. And I believe Lance told me I'm passing to Sean to get us kicked off with our program today. I'm very thankful and excited to hear our speakers today.
Thank you, Carrie and Ed. Yeah, so a couple of housekeeping things before we get officially started. We did get this program approved for training hours for county officials through the Department for Local Government, as well as city officials through KLC. For DLG training hours, I know that I think Tracy put something in the chat about it, but it is a requirement for the DLG regulations that to get the training hours, you must leave your camera on at all times during the presentation. So please be aware of that. You need to have your camera on to get the credit hours. That's the DLG. And if you are going to want to get those training hours, send your name in the chat so we can write that down. We're going to be submitting our registration list to both of those groups for the training hours, but we want to know who we need to be looking out for because I don't want to get Wendy Thompson upset over at DLG. We're going to follow the rules. So with that, let's see, we'll go ahead and I will introduce our panelists and kind of let them take over because I know that's why everybody's here and excited to hear. Talking to these folks over the past few weeks, I've been just amazed at their expertise and everything they've been able to teach me just preparing for this panel. So first we'll start with the introductions. Brad Thomas with East Kentucky Power Cooperative, Jason Halligan with Frost Brown and Todd, Jake Schirmer from the Walker Group, Casey Bolton with Commonwealth Economics, Warren Rogers with WP3 Consulting, and our moderator for today is going to be Jennifer Linton from the Kentucky Finance and Administration Cabinet. So if everybody would please turn off your microphones for now. If you do have a question throughout the program, we are going to have a question and answer session towards the end. But if you do have a question that's something topical to what the folks are talking about through the panel, put it in the chat and we'll try to keep an eye out for anything that may come up that we can answer at that moment. But turn your mics down, and Jennifer, I'll let you take over from here.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I mean, everybody knows the topic is we're talking about P3 and the P3 process, and we have Warren Rogers on here, and I know he was instrumental on that legislation and getting that passed. And I thought maybe it'd be good for Warren to talk about the history of the legislation and how this all evolved.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jennifer. Sure. I'm a lifelong water and wastewater plant contractor. All right. And 35 years in the business, and sold my company in 2016. And throughout those years, it's terribly frustrated at how projects would get all the way to the bid market, and then proposals, prices would come in, and they'd be over budget, and projects wouldn't get awarded. And I think we've all been in that situation. And then, projects have to be canceled, reduced in scope, et cetera. And so I just felt like there had to be a better way. And to me, it was design, build, finance, P3. And had seen that model in some other states. I'd seen the University of Kentucky do it very successfully over the years. And why would this not apply to, in my case, local public projects? And so, long story, but about 2014, we started to get this process underway legislatively, got a group of folks together with a lot of help from the Kentucky Chamber. And we created some legislation, ultimately got it, it was very well received by both sides of the aisle in the legislature. Ultimately got it approved by the legislature and signed by the Governor Bevin in 2016. And then we had to start educating the public about this, principally the public officials. Those people are public owners that make, that make the decisions on this, and that education is ongoing today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to help present this today, because I think my goal is to turn light bulbs on in people's head and go, wow, this is available to us. We could actually do this. For us, for my company, my current company, consulting, this all culminated in Kentucky's first local P3 that most of the other panelists today were involved in. It's the new wastewater treatment plant for the city of Brandenburg, ultimately an $8.3 million project that was necessitated by the new Nucor steel facility, $1.7 billion Nucor steel facility going in Brandenburg, in the industrial park there. And of course, Brandenburg's existing wastewater plant was in the midst of that industrial park. And so a new one had to be built, had to be designed, financed, and built in a hurry. And that's where the P3 opportunity came from. So that's my attempt to wrap up about 6 years of work in about 2 minutes, Jennifer. But
thank you. I appreciate that. I think that was really helpful. I think something else good to talk about are some of the drivers for P3. I mean, what motivates a project to go the P3 method? And maybe Brad, maybe you could talk about that with your experience. I know you've got a diverse experience, different aspects of that. Maybe you could touch on that.
Being a recovering state government employee and in this business for decades, it's amazing how you see projects come and go. And in the economic development world, just like Warren talked about on the Nucor deal, without the P3, I'm not sure that deal takes place. And, as we did a pre-conference discussion, we talked about how that really solved a problem for the company, for the community, and everybody ends up being a winner out of it. What I'm starting to see is, as Kentucky's been very successful from an economic development standpoint, you're going to see more and more opportunities, such as the one that Warren kind of talked about there. And I know some of the other panelists will talk about. Why? Because we're running out of industrial spaces. We're running out of industrial parks that have gas lines, sewer lines, the things necessary to bring opportunities to the state. But representing 2/3 of the state, or 87 counties, I get to see a wide variety of things. And one of the interesting components I'm starting to hear discussions on about P3s are with parks, talking about trying to add amenities to to go along with the recruiting aspects of bringing large facilities in. You have to think about how are you going to lure those workers and potential even remote workers with
Hey, Chuck,
new
sorry,
investments.
I'm on Paul Carousel today, so.
So, and talk about how those can actually play out pretty well for some of these communities. I know right now there's about 4 communities I'm working with on large scale park projects, and every one of them are looking towards P3 to help solve some of the funding gaps, to help solve some of the availability of dollars to bring the project to proper scale and scope, because I think that's one of the things that P3 also can help, is bridging the gap between the vision and reality.
Okay, thank you. And it may be good, I know both of you have alluded to the Brandenburg P3, and it may be good just to familiarize everybody with that. Jason, since you kind of represented the city, I believe, on that process, could you just give an overview of what the problems were they faced and why they went down the path of the P3 and how that worked? I mean, I don't know if everybody knows, but this is, I guess, officially the first successful local government P3 that's been implemented. So if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer. So Brandenburg really had been looking at expanding their existing wastewater treatment plant for a number of years. It started probably 4 or 5 years ago. Their plant was underperforming. They're falling out of compliance with state and federal regulations, and they needed to expand their capacity a little bit. So back in 2017, the city had actually put in and submitted a facilities plan to accomplish those improvements, and applied for funding with the Kentucky Infrastructure Authority, but the project was never funded. So the city's plans were expedited in 2019 when Nucor Steel announced that they were going to build now a $1.7 billion plant on the site of that existing plant. So the city was really had a strong need to expedite their process. At that point, the city had no idea where they could put a new plant. They essentially needed to build a new plant offsite. They need to decommission their current plants, get everything up and running in time to avoid any disruption to that Nucor Steel plant. And just for context, Brandenburg is a small town of a few thousand people. Nucor Steel was going to provide 400 jobs with an average wage of over $70,000. So this would be a game changer for Brandenburg. The city had no interest in slowing down that project or disrupting that in any way. So we were brought on in late 2019 at Frost Brown Todd to represent the city and help them just figure out their options. And part of those options included P3s. And early on, we thought that a P3 process would probably be the only way to successfully deliver the project in time. So first we had to find land. Fortunately, we were able to work out a deal with Nucor that instead of having to go off and purchase land on another site or condemn other property, we were able to actually use part of the parcel of land within the same fenced-in compound of Brandenburg's existing plant, slightly offset enough for Nucor's purposes, but be able to tie into a lot of that existing infrastructure. So that saved the city a lot of time and some funds as well. Then we had to figure out who can pay for it. And fortunately, Meade County, with the former judge executive, Jerry Lynn, who unfortunately recently passed away, he had reached and entered into an interlocal agreement with Mayor Joyner to pay for half of the plant. Nucor had passed on some funds to the fiscal court, and the court agreed to pass on those funds to pay for half of the project. So with land in place and a potential revenue stream on top of the ratepayers, it looked like there was a potential project here. So we put out a request for proposals for P3 proposals, and we took a very broad approach when we did that. I don't know if this is how we'll always do our future P3 RFPs, but there we try to maximize flexibility for the city. So we allowed proposals to include just the design build portions of the new plant, had proposals just for the financing portion. We allowed optional proposals for operations or maintenance or any other innovative solution that the private sector could come up with. And we allowed the private sector to submit any combination of any of those categories. And we're very fortunate that we did receive proposals under all those categories. And so the city did have multiple choices to choose from. And I will point, the city also reserved their right to use traditional funding sources like a KIA loan. Because P3s were so new to Kentucky, we just weren't sure who in the private sector would have time to form a team with a design and builder and a financer to be able to put in a good proposal for the city. And that's why we maintain so much flexibility. And we even asked the proposals to include what would the cost difference be if we went through the traditional route versus their proposed route to help the city make that informed decision. So at the end of the day, the city awarded a contract to the Walker Company of Kentucky in partnership with GRW Engineers and WP3 Consulting to design and build the new facility. The city awarded the financing contract or component of the contract to Ross Sinclair and Associates, who partnered with KLC Financial Services and funded the project through the Kentucky Bond Corporation. And so in the end, there were a total of 10 partners who all worked together to deliver the project. I'll let Casey describe at some point just the incredible savings that the city received and describe how we got there. But at the end of the day, it was about $3.5 million of savings and upwards of a year in time. And so when speaking of drivers of P3 projects, on top of these external economic development projects that would help drive a project like Brandenburg, we also should look at proven concepts. And now we have a proven concept for P3s in the wastewater treatment space and water infrastructure space in Kentucky. And I firmly believe that every community should start all of their capital projects by exploring their P3 options, especially when it comes to wastewater treatment plant projects.
Thanks, Jason. Well, Casey, I think Jason kind of handed off to you there. It was going to be one of my questions for you, but do you want to talk about the financing opportunities that are in P3s? And I don't know how much detail you can give about Brandenburg, but maybe what you've seen with P3 and the financing opportunities.
Sure, of course. Just for everybody that doesn't know, I'm with Commonwealth Economics. We're a municipal advisory, financial advisory firm based out of Lexington. We work on a lot of public-private partnership projects, even some that don't traditionally have that name, but really function the same. What you find in a lot of these projects is that there are different opportunities to realize savings to the overall project cost, and that is not always, and I think that's the beauty of a P3, is that is not always just in the construction cost or just in the financing cost. The beauty of the P3 is you can structure these in a way that you assign responsibilities and risk based on the value of various components. I think what we found in the Brandenburg project is that the financing component wasn't really an issue, as Jason alluded to, with the city and county being willing to participate and able to participate, with their capacity. So the financing component of that project ultimately, while RSA was the financier, the ultimate underlying credit was generally the city and counties. So the financing there was generally provided by the public, but the design and the build was provided by the private sector. And so that's really where a lot of the savings came in. And as I think Brad alluded to previously, you get a significant time savings by doing what we would refer to as a design build model, where the private sector both designs and builds the project, versus a design bid build, which is traditional procurement practice, where the public sector will either design it themselves or hire somebody to design the project. And then you put it out to bid in a separate RFP process. And then whoever is selected for that out of that process is who ultimately builds the project. By doing a design build model here, ultimately the construction team that was selected was able to deliver the project in a much shorter time frame, because you cut out that extra step, and you also have the same design team and the same construction team working together on the front end of that process. We estimated, well, just so everybody knows, part of our role on that project was actually to conduct an analysis that is utilized in the local approval process that shows that the P3 method was a beneficial structure to use there. So we ran some numbers with the help of Jake and the construction team and Jason and the city to build that analysis. And what we found is that time savings estimated roughly at about a year versus what it would have taken under a traditional design bid build, resulted in a roughly $1.5 million in savings to the overall project. So not only are you saving that in terms of actual dollars, the piece that I think Brad mentioned is the Nucor project, maybe didn't have the time to wait for a traditional design bid build method. So without this utilization, you may lose the Nucor project altogether. They may go somewhere else that's more nimble or ready to meet their needs in Indiana or wherever it might be. So, that really shows, and that value isn't in our analysis. So, you save $1.5 million there. We also did a piece on the financing that compared a couple of the options, and we found that actually that there was a benefit to going the public route there versus what might have happened in the private sector. And while it was marginal versus what the private sector would have done, we also found that versus a KIA loan, which is another public financing method that traditionally has a really low interest rate, just because of the timing of that project, it made sense to issue what would be just a tax exempt revenue bond through the public sector, but not through the KIA program, which usually has some different requirements as far as prevailing wage and other things like that add to the construction cost of the project. But the spread and the interest rate resulted in actual savings by keeping the tax exempt revenue bonds as the financing source versus a KIA loan. That outweighed the interest savings that would have happened under the KIA loan by about a net difference of $2 million over the 20-year period. So that's a little bit, I guess, for that project of the thought process that goes into it as you're considering a P3 structure with regard to which components you might allocate to the private sector or which components you might keep under the public sector's purview. One thing you want to also consider is operations and maintenance and whether that stays in the public eye and under their purview and at their cost, or if that remains in the private sector. And I think what you generally see in the P3 world is you get different levels of comfort with regard to turning over certain services, operations, fully to the private sector. I think there's a bit of a stigma about it still. But what we do often see when we run these analyses on the front end is that oftentimes there is cost savings over time from an operations and maintenance perspective as well. It really just depends on the project, the nature of the project, and where it's located and what the ultimate savings might be.
And if I could add to what Casey was saying, speed was definitely the key to this project. And, the way Nucor phrased it to us is if this wasn't running in a parallel track, they were going to pick up and go somewhere else. And I can tell you from being an economic developer across the state, right now we're dealing with anywhere from 5 to 10 projects that are very similar in nature to the scope and magnitude of this project in Brandenburg. The question that I will ask is, if your firms are brought onto this, please keep in mind time is of the essence. And if we can eliminate time and ultimately drive these industrial sites to be the site, that's going to be the secret to our success going forward. And as I said, Kentucky's been very successful in economic development, but part of our problem is that we have been successful with industrial parks that were built 20, 30 years ago. We do not have a whole lot on the table right now for large scale projects. And if we land a couple of these in the state, it's going to become a very alarming issue going forward. So just once again, I think the speed is the key to this.
That's a good point, Brad. And it kind of leads into what I was getting ready to ask Jake from the contractor side of things is, what advantages did you see on this project compared to what Casey was talking about on the normal design bid build, which is traditional? What did you all learn from this?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. Well, we really talk about, and Casey's talked about this, Warren's talked about this, Brad has, Jason, is the time and money that has been saved on this project. From a timing perspective, if you look at when we actually signed the contract, which was September 30th, and I'm sorry, let me introduce myself. I'm Jake Schirmer with the Walker Company. We were the contractor on the project. So we signed a contract with the city at 9/30. We received a limited notice to proceed. So we were able to do a lot of the site work ahead of time. And then in January, we got a full notice to proceed, or actually February, the full notice to proceed. But we've already been working alongside the designer, who is GRW, who did a phenomenal job on this. They were able to, as we were doing the site work, run a parallel path on the design. And now we have a complete design and we're moving full steam ahead. We will be completed on 6/30, 2022, which if you look at the time to start design and finish construction, that's way ahead of what the typical process is. And so I just want to kind of reiterate what everyone else has talked about was the time component. And if you think of time as money, in traditional normal environment, our inflation or the inflation of construction typically goes up about 4% a year. And if you were to draw out an additional year or two, it could put a project, $10 million, $20 million project out of budget real quick. But the other benefit that we were able to do is provide cost savings. And Casey mentioned this through Davis-Bacon. We don't have to have prevailing wages on this project, as well as American Steel. We don't have to use American Steel because our funding is not coming through a federal source. So this has really been a benefit. I feel a win-win for everybody involved, the city, the contractor, the designer. We have worked hand in hand to come up with cost savings that, normally the designs are already created and there's not as much flexibility on getting the contractor's input during that process. So the city is going to win big on this. They're going to get the product done faster than normal, and we're going to have, save them a tremendous amount of money. So it's been a great experience to date, and we're keep plowing forward.
Just to reiterate, I think what Jake and I are both kind of circling around as well. The being able to do the design and the build together with the same team, and the time that it saves, you lose that time lag between doing a design and a bid and a build. You also understand on the front end or at the same time what the cost is going to be. So you don't have a design team designing a project at a cost that after the bidding you might find to be unrealistic to even move forward. So then you would have to go back to the drawing board and adjust it and rebid the project. And so you run into issues there as well that can be mitigated through a P3 process.
And just to add on to that too, I think that collaboration will help avoid change orders in the future, because the designer and builder, they're working together, identifying problems before they come up and keeping the project on time and under budget.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I can tell you that the collaboration between Walker and GRW allows GRW during their design to have real-time evaluation of what they're putting on paper. In other words, do you want to go this route or this route? And Walker's able to provide that immediate feedback from a cost standpoint or a constructability standpoint. Quite often you don't have that obviously in the design bid build arena, and that has saved cost in the project and and also on the schedule. And we're able to pre-order some key elements of the project, and it also it allows us to be creative. I think the whole team to kind of be creative to solve an issue, and that part of it I think has worked very well. I'm very happy with that, how that's all worked out.
So everybody, I mean, Brandenburg, of course, was a great P3, and I mean, it seems like the right delivery model. What do you see? And I'm gonna open this up to any of you to answer. When is P3 not appropriate?
So that's tough to say. I'll chime in on that. You know, because I do think that part of the due diligence that a city should take, or local government should take, is to explore all of your options. Why start?
I didn't know if maybe you would ever run across a scenario where you looked at going P3 and then you realized, no, that's not going to work here.
I do think conceptually, if you had a project where you had a number of grants that could cover most or all of the project, then if that's free money, then maybe if the time works out for you, it's okay to take the slower process to deliver the project. We're all still exploring how low the dollar amount can be for a project for it to make sense. Brandenburg was 8.3 million. We're working on other projects in that ballpark, maybe a little under, maybe a little over. I've recently spoke with a developer from another state, a neighboring state, that they focus on P3s there at the $2.5 million level. So I think we're still exploring and interested to see how low can we get now.
Did anybody else have any comment on that one?
I think Jason's right. Under what scenario would you not consider a P3? If you've got 100% grant money and plenty of time, then perhaps P3 is not what you're looking for. But that condition rarely exists, and so while it's not applicable to all projects, I think it's very viable for many projects. As Jason says, we think down to maybe $1.5 million. Statutorily, they have to be, Jason, I believe, over $800,000 to be able to pursue on a P3 basis. So it's really applicable for projects large and small, simple, complex, even maintenance-oriented projects and long-term construction projects. So I think there's a wide variety of projects it's applicable to.
And if I could add, I think the only thing that's really holding back P3 is fear. People are always scared of the unknown. And, you know, we've talked about P3s for decades, it seems like, here in Kentucky, but having something that this team, Warren and Jake and Jason and Casey, were able to put together, now you've got that star to kind of guide people with. Because if the city of Brandenburg and the Meade County can pull this together, I got 119 other counties that should be looking at this. And I think that's really the tip of the iceberg as far as projects going forward. Is it's about the fear of the unknown. And if somebody else hadn't done it, I don't know that if Brandenburg hadn't stepped up to the gate, I don't know that we'd be talking about P3s as much as we are. But every project I'm talking with on a community, it's on the tip of the tongue, and they're all kind of looking at, well, can we make our project bigger, better, and quicker using a P3?
Yeah, and we think large, and we try to dream big when we're talking P3s. I know we've often spoken about it in terms of private financing, and that's generally the model you see in other states. But we benefit a lot in Kentucky from a very broad P3 statute. I'd say it's one of the top 5 in the nation, partly because most other states, at least as of a few years ago, their P3 statutes are almost exclusively limited to transportation projects. Well, here we have a separate transportation P3 statute and then a non-transportation P3 statute for both the state and local level. And P3s are defined here to include construction or financing of a capital project, or even services, which one day, I hope that within the next 5 or 10 years, we'll have some service P3s that we see other states taking advantage of. So P3s here are defined actually more like a process to follow than actual components of it. And so outside of just considering private financing, I strongly encourage all of our clients to consider tying in maintenance into a design build plan, and maybe operations as well. In the back of my mind, I'm always wondering if the design and construction firms were responsible for maintaining the asset over time, would the design look different? And would the public benefit from that model? And I think that's something that's worth exploring. Why not include in a solicitation document a request for operations or maintenance to see what that cost looks like, see how that community would benefit? So we start all projects by starting with the P3 options.
That's a great point, Jason. You know, as I mentioned, there are a number of different roles and responsibilities that can be assigned to the private sector. And what we have found is that when you assign the design, the build, and the maintenance, you oftentimes get a higher quality product on the front end. And I think what you run into is that cities, counties, and state governments oftentimes look for the lowest cost of capital in the current year and don't really have the foresight to spend a little money on the front end and save maintenance cost over the long run. But when you assign all of that responsibility to a developer over, say, a 30-year period, where they have to provide a facility at a flat cost per month in a lease structure to a governmental entity, they are fully incentivized to ensure that the maintenance costs are kept as low as possible over that 30-year period as well. So they might include higher quality construction on the front end, and you don't run into this issue where you have contractors bidding on a project that's judged oftentimes too stringently upon cost per square foot or some metric that doesn't fully account for a 30-year period. So you end up with a building or a parking garage or you know, a sewer line that maybe only has a real useful life of 15 years, or you know, maybe it has a useful life of 30 years, but the asterisk is that really is going to require a significant more amount of ongoing maintenance each year. And that's a hard thing to delineate in a traditional design bid build process, because quite frankly, contractors are pretty good at putting in a low bid and then winning the contract and then putting in change orders, and you know, as the project goes along to really get the real cost in there, or just building a product that's not of the right quality.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that. And I agree 100% on the, if the developer contractors on the front end, and they're going to maintain that asset, because what you're trying to do is build the lowest total cost of ownership. So if you look at an asset and you say on the front end, it's X dollars and it's the cheapest option, which is the model that we use today, what do you think you're really getting in quality of construction? I mean, the answer is probably the lowest acceptable quality of workmanship. If you put that risk onto the developer or contractor, that's a different story, because now they are motivated by that, keeping that thing running efficiently and less costs on maintaining that project. So I couldn't agree more. It's an ideal situation for owners as they consider projects, because they will get a better asset in the long run. And if you were to look at those costs and realize those over the lifetime of the asset, they're probably saving money. So that's something that I think we should, you know, discuss with the owners as you guys interface with them.
Yeah, and how the owners get there is that the P3 law requires that our proposals and contracts are awarded on the basis of best value. And so best value has to include cost as one component of one factor to look at, but they can look at other factors as well. Generally, you see the experience and expertise of those private companies, as well as the overall quality of the proposal. And so there's a balance between knowing that you can have a high quality product from a team that can deliver and the cost. And so best value is a much greater benefit to cities than just cost alone. And I'm sorry, I say city, that's where we're seeing movement, but any local government.
Well, and Jason, you kind of led me into what I was going to ask you to touch on next. Is we've not really talked about like what the process is with, with the 45A077 P3 statute for local governments. If you could just give maybe an overview of, what the statute and the reg requires for local governments for a P3 solicitation contract.
Sure. So there's two avenues to arrive at a P3 contract. The first and most common, and the only one we've seen so far successfully, is issuing out an RFP, where the local government solicits the contract itself. The statute and regulation list what needs to be in that RFP. We follow the process. It's called competitive negotiation, but essentially it says that contract is awarded on the basis of best value. There's a lot of room for governments to customize that RFP to be as precise or as flexible as they want. And that really varies on the project itself. Once a contract is actually awarded, projects of a certain size have to go in front of the state's local government P3 board. That threshold is if a project's costs exceed 30% of that local government's, or if multiple governments combine the combined total of those 30% of their general revenue fund receipts from the previous year. That's a mouthful. But what that means, and really, one day I'd like to explore what that threshold means, because really it's almost every single P3 project is going to go in front of that board. But we went in front of the board this time for Brandenburg, and they were very thorough. Took several months to go through and examine the feasibility, looking at Casey's study from an economic perspective. Was this in the best interest of Brandenburg and the Brandenburg ratepayers? The board also looks at the process. Did we follow the correct process outlined in the P3 statute and other laws? And then finally, in the contract, the P3 statute and regulation also list a number of items that need to be included in that contract. And so with those three criteria are met, then the board meets and will vote to approve or disapprove that project. The board can decline to approve or can provide recommendations for the local government to make changes in order to be reevaluated. By statute, the board has a total of 5 months to make that consideration. So again, that board is only going to be implicated if the project value is 30% of the local government's general fund receipts from the previous year. The other way that you can have a P3 project is through an unsolicited approach. And I've heard of maybe 15, 20 or more different attempts at the state and local level for different private companies can submit an unsolicited proposal to the government entity. And this is an area where I believe Brad mentioned fear and a lot of uncertainty from the local government perspective on what to do if you receive an unsolicited proposal. That's not generally how we procure capital projects in Kentucky, but it's completely authorized. And the statute provides an exact timeline and process to follow that really gives 90 days for the government entity to review the unsolicited proposal and decide if they want to proceed or not. If they do want to proceed, then the government has to provide public notice, anywhere from 30 to 90-day period of time based on the project's value. That P3 notice is a very simple document. We've seen the state do it a couple times, half of a page, just a brief overview of the concept that was included in the P3 proposal, but not giving away any trade secrets. And throughout this whole process, the statute protects confidential information. After that P3 notice period, then it gets a little murky on what needs to happen after that. The statute says that you have to enter into an open and competitive process. That's a term used nowhere else in Kentucky law, or at least not in the Model Procurement Code. And so no one really knows what that means. There's certainly an argument. You could immediately begin negotiating. I've spoken with the bill sponsor, and that's what she said the original intent was. In practice, the state so far has actually gone ahead and issued another RFP after that point. There's some policy questions on whether that is necessary or not, because the P3 notice serves very much like an RFP. You're providing notice to the public for an extended period of time. You're receiving proposals. But right now, in practice, at the state level, you're seeing a two-phase process. So those are the two ways. But I recommend a continued education on the unsolicited process. I've talked with local governments who received those proposals and didn't know what to do with them and threw them in the trash. But there is a process, it is allowed, and it should be something that the folks on this meeting should consider submitting those unsolicited proposals with maybe a brief explanation of what the law requires so that the local government feels comfortable with how to proceed.
Okay, thank you. That helps a lot.
We've heard just to kind of piggyback, if you don't mind, Jennifer.
No, go ahead. You're good, Casey.
I think Jason, the goal of the unsolicited P3 proposal and something that is a great added value in the P3 structure in general that we haven't really touched on is utilizing the private sector's expertise and innovative thinking. So the real goal behind having an unsolicited P3 process is to give the private sector a chance to be creative and think of ideas and ways in which they might be able to propose something to the public sector that the public sector hadn't thought of. They may have a technology that somebody isn't aware of, or has, see some design or efficiency that nobody else has really thought of or is aware of. And that gives the private sector a chance to present that idea to the local governing body or even at the state level and say, we've got this idea, what do you think? And if the community likes the idea, then that's when, as Jason mentioned, they make a notice to the public that they have received this unsolicited P3. It gives the rest of the public a chance to sort of present their own ideas on the matter and see if there's even any other better ways to do it. And then you can proceed forward from there. But it really does highlight a piece of the P3 mindset that the private sector is generally pretty creative and innovative, and that's a great tool to utilize.
And I think too, if I could add one more thing, I really think the name P3 scares people. Whenever you have initials, people are always intimidated by it. What I always say is it's a cooperative type program. And, if you change the vernacular, sometimes it's more attractive. And I think a lot of times people need to understand that there's a lot of people that can be on the team. And as Casey and Jason and Jake and Warren have talked about, it's about spreading that risk and understanding how this can help and how it can really bring it to fruition. Too many times governments talk about what they want to do, but they really have no way to make it come to a reality without some guidance and some assistance. And I really think the P3 and under a different name would sound a lot more attractive, and then call it a P3 after they understand the impacts of it.
Everybody's talked, about all the great things about P3s. There's had to be some drawbacks or some obstacles or some, what are some learning experiences you've had, maybe is a better way to put it, on P3 projects, on things that could have been done differently or better, or even to Jason's point, that maybe even there's statute changes maybe that need to be made or anything like that. Just room for improvement on P3s.
Well, I do know that when we created the legislation, we knew, even though at the time it was the most comprehensive P3 legislation in the country, and it may still be today, we knew that once we began to implement and understand anecdotally information that and feedback that we might want to make some tweaks in the legislation. I think like any good legislation, we need to constantly review it. There may be some tweaks in perhaps some of the timing involved in looking for, once an unsolicited proposal is received, that the time that it is allotted for competing proposals to be received. Maybe there could be some tweaking of that. But by and large, the statute gives a lot of latitude to solve issues creatively and beyond what I just said, I'm not sure what we might tweak in it.
Yeah, I would say that on a couple of the projects we've worked on, I think one of the drawbacks and something that Jason touched on a minute ago is that it does require a lot of effort on the private sector's part to come up with the idea and present it in a formal proposal. And when they end up in the trash with no response, it's discouraging to the private sector. Why would we put all this effort in just to have the city or county ignore it? So that is a bit of a drawback on the front end. I would also say, even if they are accepted or negotiated thoroughly, they then still have to go before council or a fiscal court or somebody for approval. Particularly if the financing is coming from, a government source. So that's another area where you could get pretty far down the line, have spent a lot of money, time, effort, and then, the governing body just decides they don't like the idea, or, we're going to table it and put it back on the drawing board, or, just not fund it. Or not agree to the lease terms, even if you've negotiated it with a committee, a subcommittee of the council or fiscal court. So I think just the public sector being aware of what the implications are of putting that strain on the private sector in terms of future project. At some point that risk begins to get baked into the cost, and the cost starts to go up. The more headache you make a project on the private sector, the higher it's going to, or the more expensive it's going to cost. So, I think that's just something for all the public sector folks on the Zoom to keep in mind, is that although it is, maybe daunting or difficult to understand, there are a lot of folks out there that are really in tune with this, and our role in this process is really to educate. And we just want to constantly be educating and making sure that everybody's aware of what P3 means, how it can work, and why it has value.
And if I could add one thing there, I think also getting the discussion started early. When everybody wants to talk about the project that they want to have in hand, but very few times do people talk about, well, how are we going to pay for this? Having that P3 discussion up front, bringing in the professionals early on, just it could be some just high level discussions, but just so people can understand how this can work. And once again, I think the proof's in the pudding with the Brandenburg scenario. We keep going back to it, but once you have something that's coming to fruition through this process, I think it's easier for the government officials to grab onto. Because right now, there's a lot of big plans that are going around in the counties I deal with, but the discussions about P3 have yet to start. And I think those need to be happening at the exact same time, because there could be some cost savings that allow additional features in some of these projects. There could be also some time savings, because election cycles, whether we like to admit it or not, are very important. And if you can cut out time frames so it happens while they're still at the ribbon cutting stage in their political career, that has some benefit as well.
Brad, how would you recommend for local governments to educate themselves better? I know because you've mentioned a couple of times you think that there's fear with the local governments with the P3s. What can they do to help educate themselves? And what resources are out there?
I think they just have to start reaching out to the private sector. I mean, they have relationships with just about everybody on this call. And I think having those discussions so they get some more comfort to it. From a government side, you get hit from a lot of different perspectives, but finding somebody that's willing to help you, and not necessarily for a paycheck right up front, has a lot of weight in helping them to go down what factor. I also think, we've got to do a better job of communicating to the KCO and the KLC training programs. I've done Economic Development 101 for those programs through the years, but yet we're not talking about P3, because at the end of the day, these are all programs that are trying to push the community forward. And a lot of times the judge or magistrates or commissioners and mayors are struggling with a whole lot of information that they don't know how to get their hands around. And being able to provide some feedback to them to help them early on, I think is just the most beneficial thing that this group could be doing. And that education is sometimes face-to-face, but other times it's in larger settings.
Brad, I would agree exactly with what you said, and I would only add that our area development districts in Kentucky are charged with matching up funding with projects in their districts, and I know I've spoken with several area development district folks and even to their board at one point on this topic, and generally it's well received. I mean, their interest is to get projects done, and P3 is a way to get projects done, perhaps even projects that have languished for a long time and with that need to be done. So I am one who did went on the circuit and spoke with CAECO at 6 different regional sites back in 2017. And we did educate a lot of local people. So I think we've come a long way on this. So I think when this is brought up, perhaps with one of your clients, it may not be a totally new process to them. They've heard the term, they know that it's beginning to happen, and perhaps they need to know more about it. And maybe any reluctance they have is, well, how can I learn and educate myself about this? And hopefully it doesn't cost any money. And I can tell you that there's people on this panel that will gladly help in that education process with any client that may need to get there.
Yeah, sign me up. We're willing to go anywhere, and I know a lot of folks on the call are as well. It all gets back to the education piece. We've been attempting to educate public officials and the private sector, but mostly public officials, because that's where the project has to start at some point for a number of years. But now that we've got a proven concept, and if a city like Brandenburg can have a P3 of that size and that scale, and a community like that, that could happen anywhere in Kentucky. And so now I think that what we should do, and those of us on the panel should continue to do, is to talk about how Brandenburg works, talk about its successes and challenges and how it's going to get better in the future. I think for all of us, we're all interested in getting involved in these projects on either side of the deal. We just like this innovative type of problem solving here. For us from Todd, it's interesting. We've really found that our unique place is largely on the public side, because that's where the movement has to occur. And we at FT, and I know Commonwealth Economics, both have master agreements with the Commonwealth to provide P3 consulting services to any public entity in Kentucky. And so that's an agreement that we've been pre-approved to help out these public entities explore their options. And so we're happy to have those conversations. Those initial conversations are always free to provide that candid feedback if this is something they should pursue or not.
I guess to add to that, Jason, one of the things I would say is, most of the people in this on this call today have the ears of owners. And I would kind of listen for things that, maybe an opportunity to just say, hey, have you considered a P3? And that would be one, if they start talking about lack of capital, there's a way where, if they talk to KLC, I think KLC or whoever could direct them to someone like Jason or Casey. And the other thing you need to look at is high growth areas where timing is such an issue that they don't have the infrastructure, or they may not have what they need right now, but the timing is so critical for them to maintain, kind of like Brandenburg, to maintain that huge economic lift to that community with Nucor coming to town. It's really just listening for those cues and then you know, having somebody talk to them and see if a P3 is the right option. And to me, I think what you'll find in most cases is you'll find that it saves time and money, and both of those things are critical for the growth of the state of Kentucky. So.
And to add some real world, we talk about those big projects that are all circling around. When we land them, I'm going to tell you, we're going to have the exact same scenario as Brandenburg. Oh my gosh, we need a sewer plant. Oh my gosh, we need water lines that are big enough for us to walk through. We need these types of infrastructure done in a very speedy fashion, or we stand the risk of losing these projects. So I will tell you, there's going to be opportunities very similar to the one you saw here with Nucor popping up for the Commonwealth. And as I said earlier, I also think there's some smaller scale ones that are available for park redevelopments, Main Street programs, some of these smaller things that cities are trying to tackle right now as they try to lure residents. And that's, Jake hit the nail on the head. It's the fast growing areas are where you're going to see these opportunities. And, you know, I'll be honest with you, the fastest growing areas aren't always on your interstates. Predominantly they are, but they're not always. So be cognizant that there could be other areas that are looking for these types of projects.
And Brad, while there's no questioning that economic development is a driver of what may lead to a decision to do a P3, what we're also finding is there's a lot, especially in the water and wastewater world, there's a lot of systems out there that are under some kind of consent decree or order, or even fines, and so they're leaking dollars or under pressure, you know, and they've got to find a solution that is low cost and can happen quickly, and so kind of on the other end of the scale from economic development, we're seeing that's a driver in a lot of situations as well.
I know we're down to about 8 minutes left. Do you all have any closing thoughts, comments, anything we've not covered that you want to address?
I have one comment that I'd like to bring up, and sorry, Jason, I might have jumped in front of you there, but you know, one of the things that's happened recently is the stimulus funding, which I think many owners may feel that's an opportunity to, you know, put into infrastructure, but I think the greater opportunity is to look at it as there is probably more opportunity to apply those funds toward a project instead of, it may not cover the whole project, but the other thing to consider is there might be strings, and I don't know if we know all of that yet with that funding, and there may or may not be, I'm not 100% sure, and Jason can jump in on this, but the one thing is it could be a bridge as we talk about this whole cost going up, and I think inflation is a real risk these days. As these costs go up, this funding may be a bridge to get them to where they need to be to get the project across the goal line. So that would be one thing I'd just like to mention.
That's a good point.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I don't think we know yet what all strings might be attached to that. Both for the CARES Act and the latest stimulus bill, both now have 4 different categories of how you can use that funding. One is water, sewer, and broadband. The other and most broad use of those funds are for anything to mitigate the negative economic impact of COVID. Well, that can be interpreted very broadly. Almost anything you can do can mitigate economic impact. So communities aren't receiving enough money to pay for a whole project, more likely than not, but it can certainly kickstart the process. And my final thing I'd point out is that we've talked a lot about the public sector and how it really starts there, or at least the process to initiate a project will end up there. You have to have a local champion. All P3s are political. There's a political element in all of them, and you need a public champion to drive the process. We're very fortunate to have that in Brandenburg with Mayor Joyner and Councilman Brian Claycomb and a few others. But that's everything. Someone who can beat the drums and keep the process. Because one of the challenges of P3s is it does require a little bit of upfront process that you don't have in the traditional procurement method, but it pays for itself. That process will save time in the long run. It's worth pursuing. And so you need someone who can dream big and could help be that champion for the project.
Warren, Brad, Casey, any closing thoughts before I turn it back over to Sean?
Well, I think the takeaways here are lower cost, a much faster concept to completion delivery, and the ability to shed risk to the private sector. And I think those are the primary benefits that P3 has for public entities.
And my last 2 cents is we need to start waving the flag of success in Kentucky. Too many times we want to think about things that didn't work out, or, oh my gosh, the trouble we went through. We need to really look at those projects that have really had the game-changing opportunities and how it really came together. And I'll be the first one. My Kentucky Touchstone Cooperatives do not serve the Brandenburg site, but I work very closely on that Nucor deal. And we all need to be waving the flag of how this group and others came together to solve a problem that was going to derail the project. And now we're looking at a game changer coming to Brandenburg. It's going to impact 119 other counties besides Meade. And that's the type of projects that can happen with a P3.
I would just add that any project can be a P3. Don't get pigeonholed into wastewater or any other public service. It could be transportation, it could be government office buildings, it could be park amenities and operations and maintenance, or it could be, we've looked at rehabilitation facilities operated by the private sector to decrease the impact on jail populations. So, it's a broad net, and if you just can identify the need, as Jason and some others have mentioned, there's probably a way to do it through a P3 and get some feedback from the private sector and leverage that expertise.
Sean, I think we have ended right on time. Do you want to open it up for questions?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for all the insight into this. And I do want to open it up for questions. And I'm going to start because I've got a lot of questions, which I've been running past a lot of the panelists even leading up to this, and I'm sure they'll be hearing from me again after this. But one thing we talked a little bit about is the fact that the Brandenburg project was the first successful local P3, but I suspect it wasn't the first attempt at a local P3. We've had some that have faltered out of the gates for one reason or another. We've talked a little bit about where we can kind of get tripped up, but do you see that when these projects have not moved forward, it's been mostly because of a misunderstanding from the private sector or from the public sector rather? Or do you see a lot of times public sector is interested in moving forward, but you simply can't find a financing model that really makes sense for the investment that needs to be made?
If I could jump on that one, Casey, you'll probably jump in on this one too. I think people a lot of times don't understand that there's some other mechanisms out there like tax increment financing that have take on that P3 role. I can tell you that running that program for 20 plus years for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, there's a lot of success stories, but there's a lot of horror stories too. And I think a lot of times those stories are dictated about how well the local government understood the path they were getting ready to go down. And I will say this, that as we have these discussions, sometimes people try to find projects for a program as opposed to try to find a program that works to help a good vision and a good project.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Brad. You know, we often say if you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3, and the beauty of it is you can structure the deal such that you maximize the value and protect the public sector from risk where appropriate, and maintain the risk at the public sector where desired and where appropriate. I think a lot of the negative feedback might be related to projects that as Brad said, you know, the public sector didn't realize what they were agreeing to, or the messaging was such that the public itself didn't fully understand or doesn't fully understand, you know, the pros and the cons of various deal terms. I think the other piece is that the devil is in the details. Understanding where that risk is allocated is key, and ensuring that proper safeguards are in those contracts is key as well. You hear a lot about some of the negative P3 projects and where they've gone wrong. A lot of it is in the devil of the details. You know, you don't hold the private sector accountable for quality or delivery time or things of that nature where they really need to be, or you have a guaranteed contract that doesn't make sense, or the downside risk isn't fully understood or clarified. And I think as people like Jason and our firm and work with the private sector and really try to educate the public sector on important things to keep in mind as these deals are structured, you know, I think once you are able to have that conversation and lay out the worst case scenarios, the probable scenarios, you'll get a lot better reception. And I think to Brad's point, I think if the media would focus a little bit more on the successes instead of the failures, I think it would go a long way in giving governing officials comfort as well.
I'd like to add to that as well. I think the other key thing is to having the right partners in the group. One of the things that I would say about Brandenburg was there were 10 partners in that group. It took a lot of people to work together and on all sides of the table. So you have Frost, Brown, and Todd, who did a great job shepherding the public. And they were providing the city of Brandenburg an education and as a trusted advisor. So that to me helps get the municipality that education that we've talked about throughout this discussion. They get an unbiased feasibility study that has to be done by a third party, and it has to assess whether or not this is the right delivery method for their project. So there's a little bit of a education that has to happen that I think has really caused the biggest challenge for these P3s to really take off. But to what Warren talked about earlier, this just started in 2016, right? This is still in its infancy stage. And as we educate more and we have more and more successes along the way, the story will get easier and easier to tell. But it's having the right people on the team to make it happen. And I think Jason and Casey can help the public talk through a project and see if the deal makes sense.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to unmute and speak up. Well, in that case, I'll take the next question too. I do have one more question I wanted to kind of talk about. Working from the design side of these things, you know, we see RFPs, RFQs, RFIs all the time, and we respond to them on the design bid build. You know, that's just part of business. It's every day we're putting these things together, and there are a lot of people, I'm sure, on the call who deal directly with those proposals on top of the principals that are with us today too. Describe kind of what, you know, when the RFP comes out, specifically, you know, we can talk about the Brandenburg project. I've seen that RFP that was put out. At that point, as the teams are looking to put together a proposal, how much interaction is there with the owner at that point. Obviously, in a traditional design bid build process, there's really no, or should be no, interaction at that point. But there's only so much information you can get from an RFP. So is that something where they have representation to talk through any specifics? Is it completely hands off? Is there a question and answer period that's sort of baked into the process? Jason, you may be able to talk about it, Jake, because you've dealt with it from that side.
Yeah, you're right. There are certainly restrictions on those communications, especially once an RFP has been published. So the P3s have to follow the competitive negotiation statute, and there's a local government version that you could find online. And in that, it says that when a government has, and the selection committee has conversations with any bidder, you have to have that same conversation with everybody. It has to be a fair process. So in Brandenburg, we did have mandatory meetings, and we had 2 question and answer periods where we were live, and one was in person and the other one was virtual. We had our first mandatory meeting the day COVID hit. So the COVID certainly played an impact on how this process proceeded. And we also accepted written questions. And I believe we answered about 55 different written questions to provide that feedback. So yes, there can be a dialogue. Out of a sense of fairness, we have to have the same conversations with everybody.
And let me just add, that's very accurate description about the RFP. But Jason, if I'm an entrepreneur and I see a public issue, a problem to be solved, and I want to create an unsolicited proposal, that doesn't prevent me from asking questions and getting information from a public entity. Is that correct, or are there constraints on that?
So the P3 regulation touches on this, although I think that there's some room for clarity on that issue. I think a fair reading of that regulation is that you can have conversations about a need with a public entity. What the government can't do is help actually prepare the document itself of an unsolicited proposal. But that's an area of the law that, to my knowledge, has never been enforced. It's never been tried by a court. So no one really knows what it means. And I think right now, even though there is an unsolicited proposal process outlined in law, a lot of communities are very hesitant on engaging with the private sector. So to sum that up, I think there is room to have a conversation on their need. I think the safest bet would not to be discuss an unsolicited proposal, because that regulation says that the government shouldn't provide any endorsement or direction, but it's still in context of the proposal itself. So I think it could be interpreted to talk about the document. So a little gray area there, but I think there's some room for conversations.
Does anybody else have any other questions for the panel? I don't think that I saw any specific questions in the chat box. Last call, and I'm going to let everybody go. Who is that?
I would like to ask a question if I could.
Yes,
It's Claire.
absolutely.
I'm Claire. I'm from Ross Tarn Architects. I know some of you. I know Casey had touched on this about not really pigeonholing yourself in one specific. And I think we're really seeing higher education and universities become a bit of a hotspot for P3s. And so I would love to know if you guys think that the same motivators would be the same for universities and higher education that's driving P3s, or if they would look for different motivators, and if there's ways on our end that we can also help educate them on P3s still, if there's any options for us for education.
Sure, I'll take the first stab at that. I think they are very similar. The motivators are very similar. I think if you've got a community that's trying to improve its infrastructure, the end goal is to provide a better experience for its citizens and to attract more citizens, at least generally, I would think. I think it's very, very much the same for the university. And I think the other component is keeping costs down or reducing costs where possible. Some things that we have heard thrown out and seen, carried out in other states involve energy operations. A lot of these universities do their own energy program. And what you've seen a lot, UK has done a lot of dorm projects. You've seen a lot of student housing options that allow higher quality of product to be provided to the students without without the university having to, go to the General Assembly and directly foot that bill. So I think a lot of the potential uses are similar and the same. In terms of operations or anything that's more on the service side, you often see something in the way of food services or things like that. I don't know that I've seen much thought outside of that, but that's where you look to the private sector to think of those types of things. Anywhere where there's room for improvement that the school is maybe doing inefficiently, I would think that's where the private sector really comes into play. A lot of that identification comes from folks like engineers. We know very much that there's a wastewater and water provision issue in many places around the state. We, as a financial firm, we would love to try to help solve that problem, but we don't know, from a design or operations or maintenance standpoint, really where those advantages might be. So we would rely on engineering firms to come up with those ideas, so to speak. And if you had an idea that you thought they're just really doing a bad job here at this, we would love it for you all to approach us and say, we've got an idea. What do you think? Is there a way to do this as a P3? Can we structure this and put together an unsolicited proposal? And we would help you put that response together, whether it's to a university, to the state, or local government.
And if I could jump in there, I really think there's an opportunity for P3s with operation of athletic facilities. And the reason why I say that is that a lot of times governments or universities are really good at building buildings, but they're terrible about operating them. And I think the P3 model offers some opportunities to get it outside of the government's control to run the facilities and to be able to keep up with the maintenance. And I think that's a little bit of that stuff that I'm starting to see a lot of communities trying to figure out their amenity sides. A lot of universities kind of in that same way, student activity centers, those types of things. I think those are perfect P3 type projects. And I'm kind of waiting for, we've seen the wastewater project take off. I'm kind of waiting to see that park or athletic facility discussion take off, very similar to like an E-Town sports complex or a grand park that you see up in Indiana, where it's people coming together, making a much bigger project and mitigating the risk that a government or a university or college would have to see.
And my favorite project, besides Brandenburg, is really University of Kentucky's parking garage. That is a phenomenal example of a creative P3 that really leveraged the benefit that public and private sector could provide. There on that project, it provided this new parking garage. The university is operating and maintaining the parking garage side of that structure because they have a robust parking system, and it made sense for the UK to continue to do that. But then you have retail space on the first floor where the private side is running that side of the facility. And that's really a way to leverage the strength of both sides. So creative mixed use developments have a lot of opportunity at the university level and any governmental entity.
All right, thank you all. Did have a question come in the chat. Can you use integrated project delivery method, the IPD approach with P3 in Kentucky in lieu of the tradition of the design build model that we've talked about? So I guess the question is anybody familiar with IPD and integrated project delivery? And is that something that that would be applicable and potentially using with P3?
I think the answer is yes. I think the optimal use that really benefits all sides and apportions the risk appropriately is the use of progressive design build, and that allows if an owner requires a lump sum price up front, well, the private sector, the contractor involved is going to have to allow for contingencies for inflation or unexpected design issues and all of that. But if you can talk about a target price, and then as design advances, always there being an off ramp for the owner, and then to get design to a certain point, perhaps 60% design, and then agree to a lump sum number. That allows for collaboration, involvement with the owner, all the way through. And to me, that's the optimal way. That's not exactly the way Brandenburg was done, but I think that is the optimal method for delivering these projects that protects the owner's interest, and I think really does provide for a more collaborative and successful process.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that that's basically what we're talking about when we talk about having a team on the design and construction side that presents a plan together and works sort of collaboratively, and then you structure a contract with the public sector that has certain caveats, requirements, and incentives to perform to a certain expectation. As I understand it, that's generally what an integrated project delivery method would be, is you have a full team working together at the same time on a project design and delivery that allows that type of cost savings and time savings.
If I could actually, sorry, Sean.
No, go ahead, please.
If I could actually round out your previous question, Sean, and really piggyback off what Warren said about the conversations authorized between the public and private sector. Once an RFP is out on the market, then the government needs to be much more deliberate and careful with the conversations they have. However, there's always an opportunity for the government to issue a request for information. And we didn't take that approach for Brandenburg, largely because we knew most of the facts we needed. We knew where the funding sources were coming from. We knew the location. While we were open to the type of design of wastewater treatment plant, the scope was still fairly narrow. We've had other projects that are much broader and much more creative that are new to Kentucky. Everything from downtown revitalizations projects to indoor arenas, these new type of creative projects where we don't have good examples to point to. And so in those types of P3s, they're trying to maximize innovation. If you can afford the time, I think a best practice would be to issue out a request for information. And there, it's perfectly acceptable and common practice to receive written material from the private sector, but also to schedule presentations, one-on-one conversations. And as long as you're fair with that process, it's a great way to have a formal method of getting that personal feedback from the private sector. And that just gets back to our point of exploring all of your options. So again, if you can afford the time, I'd recommend issuing that RFI out there and having those conversations before you draft an RFP that might need to be a little bit more narrowly tailored, and you have to button up a little bit with the conversations that you have.
Thank you. Yeah, the question came to me because as I look back on some proposals that have happened in the past, not only with me, other people I'm sure in the business, it's nice to be able to have flexibility in your offering and come up with innovative ideas, but you don't know what you don't know, and it may be that your innovative idea that you love, A, the owner does not really like that, but B, it's not actually possible, and you didn't know it because you didn't have the full amount of information needed to put a proposal forward, going down whatever track you've chosen. So that was where my curiosity was there, being able to know, even though you're offering some things that might be outside of the norm or innovative, you want to know that it's actually possible. I did have another question come through. Outside of talking to our specific clients and our owners that we deal with every day, is there somewhere where these P3 discussions are happening in a pretty broad way? Is there ways we can kind of find out, short of just watching for RFPs to come out, to see kind of what's happening in the world of local P3s and what may be developing? Is this kind of thing open? Is it pretty much public record as Frost or Commonwealth are hired on through your master agreements to do these sort of studies? Is that well known? Is that published somewhere so we can kind of keep an eye if we want to start talking about getting involved or putting teams together for projects?
Jason, does the state have a website for their P3?
There is a P3 website for the state, but I've actually looked at it since we've been on here, and it doesn't look like, I mean, it's got information as far as, you know, the statutory information and that kind of stuff, but there's not a lot on there.
Yeah.
So
That's what
DLG has, I'm sorry, Casey.
Go ahead, Jason.
So DLG has a site where they list at least RFPs out there. I've had a few RFIs I've submitted to them, and they did not. But DLG's website is a good opportunity to watch local government P3 activity. I know KLC recently launched an RFP, RFQ page just in the past few months. You know, and I'm sure for all of us, we're happy to have anyone's contact information to be able to directly provide any opportunities we have. A common complaint I hear from my clients from all corners of the state is having very few responses to their RFPs. And so communities are looking to have more partners and get more creative ideas. So any suggestions you all have and how we can reach out to folks, we'd be happy to hear those.
Great, thank you for that. Are there any more questions? We're getting towards our time limit here. As I said, I could keep asking these guys questions all afternoon, but I think they have jobs to do, so we got to let them go at some point. But does anybody have one last question for the group? Going once, going twice, doesn't look like it. So again, thank you to our panelists so much. This has been very informative, and I think it's pretty clear with the state of federal funding and state funding these days. Private partnership and private investment is going to be key to getting a lot of these projects done moving forward. We look forward to seeing you all at one of our next events. Again, panelists, thank you. Does anybody else, any of the other board members have anything they want to say before we go? If not, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Bye. Prepare to be bounced out.